So, there we go. Okay. The moderator for this panel is Joshua Smee. Josh and I have been working together on Coalition Canada Basic Income for a while now, as well as on the Atlantic Provinces Basic Income Now group. So we've had a lot of opportunities to interact around basic income. Joshua Smee is the CEO of Food First Newfoundland, a provincial nonprofit organization that works with communities across Newfoundland and Labrador to advance the right to food and to further their vision of a province where everyone can eat with dignity and joy. Passionate about systems change and the power of collective action, Josh has taken a lead role in many coalitions and campaigns. He co-chairs the Provincial Food Security Working Group with the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador and sat on the province's Health Accord Task Force. Outside of work, Josh sits on many boards and committees and has been heavily engaged in work around civic engagement, local food, and the arts. So welcome. Josh, where are you? There you are. Okay.
Thanks, Mandy.
You're welcome.
And yeah, thank you for that, and welcome all our amazing panelists. It's such a pleasure for me to get to see people not on a Zoom screen. This is my first chance to meet many of the people that I've been working with from my little corner in St. John's for the last several years, and it's just such a pleasure. So I'm really excited to be here and to be able to hear from some really wise humans who are at this table. So we're going to jump right into it. We'll have around 10 minutes for everyone to speak from their spots, or if you'd like to use the podium, feel free. Just like hip check me out of the way, I'm good. I'll give you a little kind of wave at around 7 minutes. So if you see like a jumping in your corner of your vision, that's probably what's going on. So we'll have about 10 minutes max each, and then we'll have a chance to have a bit of a conversation. I have some questions, but I'm sure that that folks in the room will as well. So Kendall, are you good to be our first person up? And do you want to kick me off at the podium?
Yeah, like I'd rather use the podium.
All right, sounds good. Can I read? Tell everybody who you are.
Yeah.
Sweet. So people in this room who are from Halifax, probably many of you probably know Kendall. I don't, but I'm excited to hear from him. So he's a member of Basic Income Nova Scotia and knows firsthand what it's like to live in poverty and survive on income assistance. He's been an anti-poverty advocate for more than 20 years, and he's also a journalist, publishing articles in the Media Co-op and later in the Nova Scotia Advocate. Kendall writes a blog right now, which you should all read, for What Matters Journalism, and he publishes on topics like how basic income would improve people's mental health and well-being, which is speaking, I think, all of our language today. Poverty and social isolation, how a basic income would eliminate the need for food banks and soup kitchens, which is something that very much speaks to me personally. So Kendall, come on up. We're excited to hear from you.
Oh, thank you. Well, he pretty much gave the introduction as to who I am, but anyway, over these past couple of years, and especially since COVID has ended, and even when COVID started and throughout the course of its whole time, we right here in Halifax alone have seen reasons left and right as to why a basic guaranteed income is needed. But overall, as many of you in the audience know, the Employment Support and Income Assistance Program provides the standard household rate of $950. And that is to live on, and that's got to include your rent, power bill, and especially if you are not lucky enough, like I am, to have a part-time job supplementing your income. But my poverty advocacy started years ago when I was put through loopholes with qualifying for stuff for the Department of Community Services. I told this story time and time again for those of you who have followed my past journalism in both the Halifax Media Co-op, Nova Scotia Advocate, and now on my For What Matters Journalism blog. By the way, you will find my blog at Worth Matters at blogspot.ca is where you'll find it. Anyway, I want to speak today about the increasing evidence that we saw within the past couple of years as to why definitely something better than the current standard household rate provided through income assistance is needed. And the answer to that, of course, is basic guaranteed income. And the thing is that over these past 2 years, we have seen the homeless population increase. We have seen the income assistance rates not increase once since this current Tim Houston government got elected. As a matter of fact, this current Tim Houston government in Nova Scotia, they're not even showing any interest in wanting to do anything to improve the employment support and income assistance program. I mean, don't get me wrong, back in Hurricane Fiona, and again, just before Christmas, they did offer a one-time payment, which for those on income assistance, which did help, but certainly at Christmas time, not enough to say that Premier Tim Houston saved Christmas, but it did help. The 250 offered just before Christmas and the 150 that was offered following Hurricane Fiona. In addition to the increasing homeless population, we also, when we go to the grocery store these days, we see inflation behave out of control. And in the recent federal budget, the one-time upcoming, I have no idea when we're supposed to get this, grocery store rebate, I think for a single person it said $254. That's only one time, not enough to save lives. And with inflation behaving out of control, over these past few months, I've been hearing about people on income assistance when they get up to the cash register, the price of what they used to pay before inflation behaved out of control is now going anywhere up to double when they get to the cashier at the grocery store. And people on income assistance has been having to put stuff back because of that. Mental health deterioration, that's been a factor for years and years of people living on income assistance, even before COVID, even before inflation started behaving out of control, even before we've seen an increase in the homeless population over these past couple of years. Something else, the rent cap that we currently have in Nova Scotia, that does help, but that still doesn't, as a matter of fact, nothing cancels out the need for basic income. A basic income would improve people's mental health quite tremendously. If you think of it, that $2,000 a month during the short-lived time observed that people were receiving when COVID first started, I believe the government is neither paying attention nor cares about how that $2,000 was improving people's lives during its short-lived time. That's the $2,000 CERB I'm talking about. Department of Community Services itself here in Nova Scotia, they put you through a lot of bureaucratic nonsense and systematic problems for you to qualify for what is available within the system itself. And it's so wrong what they do to you, like, and what they expect you to go through in the hoops in order to qualify for something like the special diet allowances, or needing a doctor's note for the extra $40 for telephone allowance. It's real, you need it here in Nova Scotia, but it's nonsense. And those are the type of things that I'm advocating for my journalism to get changed. Basic guaranteed income would solve so many problems, and we need to, and government needs to start paying attention to what type of problems it will solve in general. And that is the bottom line. There's so many different examples out there. It is just difficult these days to start pinpointing like what's what within the various complex issues that does need to be resolved for people who are income assistance recipients in Nova Scotia. So anyway, when you look at the amount of homeless population, and the last number I heard just right here in Halifax, somewhere between 500 to 800 homeless, and I'm just roughly guessing when I say this, that's not an accurate number, but that's the last numbers that I heard. There's no excuse for that. Basic income, if we had it already in place, these people would be able to afford rent. They would not have to worry living day to day, worrying about where their meals are going to come from. That's just one example of what a basic income would solve. And if that basic income was $2,000 a month, the same $2,000 that we received on CERB, just think about the jump that is if you subtract the $950 standard household rate. I don't have a calculator right in front of me, but 2,000 subtract 950, that is a $1,050 jump that people would have to live on if we were currently getting the $2,000. And I think that that's the amount that a basic income should be. One thing that is happening in Parliament these days is that is giving the disability some, but I guess I could describe it as a 60% chance of hope, but a 40% not so sure chance of hope is the introduction of Bill C-22, which is right now going for the Senate. And the disability community is living day-to-day life, hoping and keeping their fingers crossed that that Bill C-22 will someday become reality, because that will improve the lives of the disability community in more ways than one. But when you look at overall what a livable amount of income can do, there's so much opportunity out there, window of opportunity, that it would open up the door for people to be able to like get themselves involved with. One of the things that I've been thinking about over this past year is all the various things that people on income assistance and the disability community especially, but anyone in reality, should not be robbed of the right to do things like, per se, go to a movie sometimes or do anything in the entertainment field. That's exactly what the current rate robs people of, because there is nothing left within the $950 after rent is paid, after the power bill is paid and other bills, and then you got to use what's little left to buy groceries. Just think of it. And there's a whole list of things that persons like are missing out on because of the low income assistance rates, as in the area of simply getting home and socializing with people. I think more and more, and especially these days with inflation getting out of control, the ones who, per se, from the time the last soup kitchen of the day closes on Friday, 5:30 in the afternoon on a Friday when Hope Cottage closes, till Monday morning the breakfast, the free breakfast at the Brunswick Street Mission, I think about how they go all weekend socially isolating themselves in their apartments, because to these people, it is not only them getting out to the free meal, it is also the only opportunity they have for simply getting out and socializing with people in their lives. And not having a guaranteed livable income plays a strong part in why these people have a socially isolated life. Having so little money to live on plays a big part in why, in some, if not many cases, have people in their lives who are believers in the welfare and mental health stigma about them. Stigma like, oh, you're on welfare because you don't want to work. You are, and listen, that, you know, you're faking any invisible disabilities you say that you have. And the list goes on of stigma, which is something else I write about in my blog. Anyway, these people, their relationships with family members, and in some cases, the mother whose body they came out of has deteriorated because of the mother believing in the stigma about the reason of why, according to the mother, they ended up on welfare. And having those type of stigma beliefs is not right. And a few other things that I could get into is relating to the stigma is they get accused of faking the reason as to how they feel mentally. They get accused of faking any learning disabilities they may have. Plus, there is belief in the community that undocumented immigrants abuse the system, and maybe others is another example. I believe that under a basic guaranteed income, most, if not all of that stigma would go away. And because during the short-lived time of receiving CERB, I've seen a lot less of that stigma happen. But now that CERB is gone and people are back to what they used to have before COVID, I have seen stigma in recent months start to increase again. And the bottom line is a guaranteed income. It would remove the stigma. It would improve people's mental health. It would open up a window of opportunities, give people more freedom to, per se, if they want to go and further their education or whatever. Right now, for someone who is on income assistance to have the opportunity to go to college or university, you have to qualify for what is called the Career Seek program at Community Services. And I personally know one person who's on income assistance that's actually going through that program, and she is so lucky, but she had a really hard job getting accepted into that program. But if she didn't get accepted, then that then her being able to stay on income assistance and going to university, this particular person, would not be an option, because assistance would cut her off for getting a student loan. Losing your student loan because of where your income to pay rent and pay bills is coming from, that is so wrong. Because these people get this student loan to try and do things to better themselves in life. These are people who don't have learning disabilities that stops them from doing such things, such as going to university or college or whatever, that access these student loans. So again, losing a student loan because you have an interest in bettering your life and taking something at college or university, no, that should not be happening. And I would like to thank Jeff Crabenall for showing both of them videos, because those videos also pointed out a lot that relates to the stigma of what I'm talking about. That guy sleeping in the woods and the next morning waking up and going to those shelters, which we saw in the video, that has a strong relationship with what we see in Halifax today. There's no excuse for that or anything for that matter. Anyway, I think it is important that we all continue supporting the need for basic income. Like over the years, considering that advocates have been advocating for this for some time, I think we've gotten to a strong foundation of advocacy for basic guaranteed income, and now is certainly not the time to stop. If anything, we got to strengthen the amount of people that are advocating for this, and we got to, those who are currently not supporting it, we got to find ways to make them believe in the reality behind the reasons as to why we need it, because those who don't support it, they're not looking at the reality. And they need to start looking at and smelling the reality. That's what I got to say. So anyway, this kind of wraps up what I got to say. I don't know where I'm at within the 10 minutes, but yeah.
Thanks, Kendall. I think it's so important to do what you just did, which is like put some urgency to this and remind us just like how deeply inadequate, especially social assistance and the systems around it are. It's wild, and decision makers need to hear that over and over. So thank you so much. Before we move into the next speaker, Mandy, you had something you wanted to bring to the group.
Yes, I just wanted to mention that on the chat, there are some comments that are being made that are not safe and are not constructive. We are trying to create a safe and constructive space to have a discussion around a basic income. And I urge everybody who is involved to act accordingly. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mandy. So next up, we're going to continue with some first voice perspective here and ask Aron to speak. So many of you probably also know Aron Spidel. He's a disabled recipient of income assistance and an anti-poverty advocate here who lives in Dartmouth. He has degrees in history and theology and volunteers for the increase of the Commonweal and for the local branch of the Monarchist League, as well as community programs. And he's interested in lots of things: photography, genealogy, family history, motorcycles, cooking, and he bills himself, half jokingly, I think, he says, but I think that's good, as an eccentric German Scots descendant of the Plantagenets. So with, with that setup, Aron, over to you.
Thank you very much. You guys hear me all right? Eep. All right, I've been asked to speak about my experiences with poverty and income assistance, and I'm going to do that through the use of vignettes and illustrations and a slideshow behind us. I've packed more information and pictures into that because everyone likes pictures. But I'm also going to stick fairly close to my manuscript in the interest of saving us some time and keeping us on track. And I'm also going to cut some things out as I fly, just to make sure that we're not getting too far behind. So I've been in receipt of welfare, as it's also called, since an accident involving a fall down some concrete stairs a better part of a decade ago. I was on my way to work. In fact, I've worked most of my life. I grew up on a farm, which should dispense with one of the assumptions about those in receipt of income assistance. There's a very large gap between what I receive and the market basket measure, which is the measure for the poverty line here in Canada. I've been painted as a malingerer, and I deal with a system that isn't terribly responsive most of the time. I've had to deal with certain assumptions from others, a couple particular ones for illustrative purposes. How can you afford that cell phone? Or how do you have a tuxedo? Oh, it must be nice. Once it was known at one point during an emergency room visit that I am in receipt of income assistance, the assumption was made that I was seeking drugs. For what it's worth, for the record, the tuxedo is a relic from another life. The phone was a gift from a friend. I've been treated at times as if I were indeed that lying, malingering moocher of legend, and there have been times when straight answers have been a challenge from the department. I've learned to be wary of the Department of Community Services and to wait for the other shoe to drop. I've been publicly castigated for a minor error in my paperwork, and I have to cover my rear end 16 ways from Sunday with notes, witnesses, and proving over and over again that yes, I'm still disabled. Funds can disappear almost on a whim, and you don't find out until they're not in your account. So in short, it can be stressful, dehumanizing, and humiliating. When I moved after my previous building was purchased by an investment company, it was ridiculous how I had to prove that I had indeed moved in spite of advance notice, rent receipts, my landlord's verbal word, as well as 4 clergy, 3 PhDs, and a naval lieutenant as witnesses. No, no, no. They had to have that particular form filled out in a very particular way. I don't blame the caseworker. That's what the department said she had to do. In fact, at the moment, I have a really good caseworker. She's amazing. If she asked me to throw myself under a bus, I'd probably say, which one? You know? But I dread to think what's going to happen when she moves on. My experience is not typical of most. By the time that I pay my basic bills, I don't have a lot left from my income assistance check for anything else. Even as something as simple as a coffee with a friend usually requires some degree of advanced planning. I have to be careful about the clothes that I wear. Many of my garments require special care. They're not just wash and wear. Such as my tux, it has to be dry cleaned after every use. You know? So there's a lot of things that just stay in my closet. I can't afford to wear them. Life's unexpected happenings Life's unexpected happenings can be a disaster, and even the highlights can be tinged with sadness. There are times when I wonder if the game is worth the candle. And for me, as a Christian, as someone who long ago put their trust and faith in Christ, that is forbidden even in thought for me. But nevertheless, it's there. That's the impact it has on you. I'm an ISFJ on the Myers-Briggs scale, which means that I thrive on creating and living amidst order and harmony and acts of service. I'm a lover, not a fighter, as my grandfather used to say. The fact that I've had to become an advocate and a fighter says all that one needs to know about what it's like to deal with DCS. Even 8, 9 years, whatever it's been, into their so-called transformation of the system. The Byzantine Empire had nothing on our DCS. I can assure you of that. To be sure, my life is not entirely grim. I have ways I can serve, work for my hands to do as my body will let me. I have amazing friends and colleagues, and I have the absolute best stepmother in the world. Yes, I always have to get a plug in for Judy. She's pretty amazing. She really is the best stepmother ever. And I'm able to do some things now and then by the grace of God, but I mean, even so. For a more in-depth look at just what I've barely touched the surface, the reality of income assistance and poverty, I recommend the documentary My Week on Welfare by the redoubtable Jackie Torrens and Jessica Brown of Peat Media. It's been a few years, but not that much has changed. Now, moving on to basic income. Assuming that it would be higher than income assistance, and assuming that certain social programs continued and were part of it, I'd be a lot better off. Having an income that actually meets my basic needs means I'd not have to worry as much regarding the social determinants of health. 3 that come to mind: health, housing, and social inclusion. It's recognized that there is value in societal contributions by those without remuneration of a monetary sort, and that these often do double duty as a form of social inclusion. I volunteer as much as I can, for example, and I know that it has a positive impact on my mental health, my physical health in terms of my blood pressure, and I find great fulfillment in it. This same thing is borne out by a study in Malawi, for example, which I will not get into detail on at the moment. I don't have time, alas. I'd not necessarily have to worry as much about losing my home and staying in my community. We know that income assistance as it is structured now is completely inadequate to the task. If I did enter into those unfortunate circumstances, my check would be reduced to about $380 a month. Good luck trying to get back on your feet with that. I have an incredible and wonderful landlord right now. He's amazing. And my rent is affordable for me. But he's in his 80s, and there's nowhere to go. Other considerations include issues of dignity and trust with the system, as mentioned hitherto, which would theoretically be non-issues. Knowing that I have something to fall back on. an income that couldn't be taken away at a whim or an inadvertent issue, or omission rather, issues too, on my part, such as in my paperwork that I mentioned before, or life circumstances, would be huge, would be incalculable. As far as how it would feel to have a basic income, it would feel really good, and I have like 3 paragraphs left, so. 3 if I skip 6. I'm a theologian and a historian, I can't help myself, mea culpa. To be free from assumptions and stigma, to have more agency would be amazing. For me to have more than occasional access to the cultural riches of our Western civilization, I don't even have a word for that. These things that feed my mind and my soul. We talk about feeding the body. These feed my soul. If municipalities and provinces were free to devote more of their budgets to something other than plugging the gaps in our social net, in as much as they do, and then more encounters such as these might be possible. As you'll see in the last slide up there, several years ago, I had the opportunity to make a pilgrimage of sorts to Lunenburg, where my German ancestors wrested a life from the wilderness of the New World. To cut a long story short, while there, I found my 6 times great-grandfather's Bible. Now, as a Christian, to hold this relic in my hands, this sacred text, was amazing. I know I use that word a lot, but John Jacob brought it with him across the ocean almost 300 years ago. It had been lost and now was found. Oh crap, here I go. Over 800 years of family history, 40 generations, came to rest in my hands that day. I was so moved that my friend had to wield a tissue for me. Mine were occupied with gloves and holding this relic that the curator let me hold and touch as long as I promised to be careful. Tears were not part of the deal. This vignette is not just an anecdote of what was, and this was before income assistance, by the way, and an example of what it might be if we went forward with the basic income. But a drawing together of these skeins I've pondered hitherto, including a few that I've had to cut for the sake of time. John and I are not that different from each other. The caseworker behind the desk is not that different from me. You and I are not that different from each other. I mean, our socioeconomic context vary widely, and I know but very little German, never mind Old High German. Some of our colleagues here have expense accounts, from what I gather. But humans are humans. We haven't changed that much in 300 or 3,000 years. There's no reason on earth why we can't find a way forward with men and women of goodwill. There's no reason why we can't build one another up, with no need to impoverish those who have more, nor degrade those who have less. A basic income might well allow me and all of us to live and grow and contribute more to the social capital of our city and province. Not just take, but contribute. To be part of laying the foundation for everyone to have health and homes, education, which I prize highly, if it isn't already apparent, and self-actualization. And I don't think we can do any less.
Aron, I just want to say thank you for trusting us with that. I hope that we can earn it in this space with you today. That was a real window into a lot of things. So thank you again.
You're welcome.
We'll now invite Eric to speak for a little while. Some of you may know Eric Jonsson. There we go. That was a space for a shout out. I think so. So Eric works to connect the street involved population with community support services, so you can find him walking and driving all over the city. Before he was in the Navigator program, he was working with the street-involved population in shelters and as a housing support worker. He's a background in social work and geography and a real focus on advocacy and community development, and is passionate about ending poverty and working to help different communities be heard. So Eric, if you'd like to offer kind of what this looks like from your lens, we'd love to hear it.
Sure, yeah. Thank you for having me here. I'm always honored to be on the same stage as these three compatriots, I guess, because there's some amazing stories coming out of here. So thank you guys for having me here. Yeah, my name is Eric Jonsson. I work as a street navigator, which really just means I kind of wander around and talk to people who are experiencing homelessness and try to help them as much as I can, which is a pretty cool job because I work in a nonprofit, so I can kind of have a bit of money to spend on people when I can, and also just kind of work with people to figure out what's best for their situations. And so a lot of the time I just kind of listen to people and try to help them out with what they want to do. And so for me, basic income and the, working with people living in poverty, it really comes down to like trust and choice. And like an example of this is we gave people, a couple of years ago, we started doing these counts of how many people were sleeping outside. And I think that time we found 50 people. It was pre-pandemic. So we found about 50 people living outside, and we talked to them, asked them all these things. At the end of it, we're like, okay, thank you for your time. Would you rather $25 gift card to Sobeys or a grocery store, or do you want $20 cash? And I think all but one of them chose the lesser amount of money in cash because people deserve that and they want to be able to spend money on what they want to. And a lot of people I know will take a $25 gift card and they might just sell it to somebody for cheaper so they can buy what they want to buy with it, because I think that's really what it comes down to, is we can try to control people. And I think the existing system has that aspect of like surveillance and control and trying to kind of dictate how people spend their money. And it's ultimately, I think, a waste of everybody's time and effort. And it's also, I hate to argue with things in terms of like cheaper overall, because I feel like it's a really like conservative ideology that I don't agree with, of like, we need to save money and austerity and all that stuff and not have enough money to go around. I think there is enough money to go around, but if we're gonna buy into this austerity mindset, it's just cheaper if you just kind of give people money and just let them figure it out. Because like I said, you need to trust people to be an expert in their own situations, because they all are. And that's a big part of my job. Is my job is easiest when I ask people what they want and like, how can we work together to like figure this out, rather than saying, oh, hey, you're homeless, like, let me get you on assistance, let me get you an apartment, let me do all these things for you, when most of the time that's what people want anyways. It's just in their own way. And if you work with people and trust them that like, okay, we're going to do this one step at a time in the way that makes sense to me, that is comfortable for me, I think everybody benefits from that. And so another example that I saw was when, as Kendall mentioned, when CERB was released and everybody started getting $2,000, which was great for so many folks. And it was just interesting to me to see the way people spent it. Like folks that were living in a tent for months and months and months got $2,000, and some of them, the first thing they did was just buy a hotel room, and we're like, I just need a shower and a good place to stay for a couple of nights. Like, yes, it might not last me forever, but it was what they needed at the time, and I thought it was a really good use of funds. And other people were like, okay, I'm going to think of this more long term. Like, $2,000 probably won't find me an apartment right now, but it will make me be able to get a nice air mattress or a bigger tent or something like that to improve their situations. And I think it's the complete opposite of our income assistance situation, which says, okay, you're on the street. As Aron said, you get $380 if you're on the street, which is not a lot of money. And if you want money for a phone, if you want money for Ensure or some kind of special diet because of your health concerns, so you have to apply for it and jump through all these hoops and spend a lot of health practitioners' time and a lot of income assistance caseworkers' time and a lot of just everybody's time just to get the same amount of money. If you just would have given people that amount of money, it would solve everybody's problem, and we wouldn't have to be wasting our time running around for these things. And so I thought CERB was a really cool experiment that proved what I always knew, is that people are the experts in their own situations and can figure out how best to spend their money. And I think that's the biggest thing for guaranteed income, is that it trusts people to make that decision. And so in those regards, I'm a huge proponent of guaranteed income. However, I also see that as we see, there's a proliferation of rent subsidies going around lately, which means that everybody can afford, almost $1,000, $1,100 apartment if you get one of those rental subsidies. And that just means to me that the greasiest, worst landlords worst people I've ever met in my life are just charging instead of $550 for a room in a crappy rooming house, they're charging $800 for a room in a crappy rooming house because they know that the clients get this more money. So I think we need to make sure that whatever basic income we kind of fight for and we kind of get goes hand in hand with some checks on the greasiest, worst people in our society, mostly landlords, but also anybody else who profits off of poverty like that. Because if you give people more money, landlords are just going to charge more rent unless we kind of put a check on their power, because the people need things like food and shelter and those basic needs to survive. And if we don't kind of rein in the profit motive for those people, I think we really need to watch it. So that's just kind of one of those things. I got a couple other notes I wrote here. Yeah, I guess that's it. And also another example of ways that I've found people would much prefer a guaranteed income is for CPP. I see this a lot when people, they might have an injury or they might fall in hard times and they think, okay, I worked for a few years, I qualify for a CPP disability. Even though it's often much less than income assistance, a lot of people will choose that CPP disability because it's a few $100 a month, but you don't have to jump through the same hoops that income assistance does. You don't have to prove to them that you're disabled every single year. You don't have to prove to them that you're homeless every single month. You don't have to prove to them that you're in need all the time. You don't have a caseworker, like Aron was saying, that's going to kind of keep an eye on you and make you go through this Byzantine process just to get not a lot of money. And so people will choose less money for that dignity, I think, which I think is another huge benefit of guaranteed income. So I don't know how long I talked for. I talk really quickly, so it's probably less than 10 minutes, but I think that's about all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks for that lens on things. I think that's a really important few points you brought up. Also, we got to use the word greasy in a good context, which I appreciate in this conversation. We're going to cut now to our one of our other physical sites for this conference in Sydney, and be joined by Joan Salah. So I'm going to trust the tech gods are going to smile on us here. I'll introduce Joan now while we're getting that set up. So Joan's been a family doctor for the last 21 years. It's really nice to have the kind of medical health system perspective in this. Oh, there she is. She's a co-director of the LIC program, which is a teaching program for third-year medical students, and a mom to 3 teenagers. She does her work mostly in North Sydney and Sydney Mines, where she has a family practice, and she works regularly in a clinic for patients without a family doctor and in a youth health clinic. So Joan will give this a try. Make sure we can hear you. If you might want to go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Success. All right, over to you.
Great. So hello, my name is Joan Salah, and I'm a family doctor in North Sydney and Cape Breton. The population that I serve does have a high rate of poverty, and so every day I see and struggle with what that means for my patients. But I think I'll give a little background here. I grew up in Iona, which, if anybody knows where that is, it's an extremely rural area of Cape Breton, and I grew up in poverty. So I recently asked my mother how she felt about me saying that in public, and so now I have permission to say it. So thank you, Mom, for that. And I guess without going into it too much, because I know we have other people that are talking about their experience with that, I was probably about 23 years old before I really knew what it meant to have money to spend on like your basic needs. So I would have been probably my second year of university when I completely ran out of money. I wasn't sure how I was going to manage my rent the next month. And behind me was a classmate of mine who was talking about how she was using her line of credit to travel to Europe in the summer. And I like spun around and said, "What is this thing you speak of?" And it turns out that when you go to a bank and you're a medical student and you have some kind of guarantee that you are not a bad risk, they will lend you as much money as you want. And so suddenly I had access to spending money for the first time in my life. And I guess what that taught me is a few things about what poverty is and what it's not. So I'm going to start with the list of things that I have discovered that poverty is not. So poverty is not a personality flaw or a personal failure. Poverty is not a marker of low intelligence or poor motivation. It's not the result of laziness, I think, as we have discovered through this. It's also not something that a person deserves, and it's certainly not something that any child deserves. what poverty is a public health disaster. And there have been a few people sort of alluding to what this means, right? So the World Health Organization identified poverty as the single largest determinant of health that there is. So poverty worsens really every single health outcome. So in adults, it increases rates of mental health disorders, substance use disorders, exposure to violence, and I think some of those things that maybe we think about when we think about living in poverty. But it also increases rates of diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and cancer. And for people who have these chronic conditions, poverty also makes it much more likely that they're going to be poorly controlled, right? In children, poverty increases rates of low birth weight, type 2 diabetes, asthma, and death. It increases rates of death in children. Like, I mean, this is not a little impact, right? The cost of poverty, I read one part, just in healthcare spending. So we're not talking about the cost of poverty in terms of overall, or the cost of poverty in human suffering or anything like that, but just the dollars and cents that we spend in healthcare dealing with the increased burden of disease that comes with poverty was estimated. This is from 2011. I'm going to suggest it's probably higher now because I've heard things are getting more expensive. It was $7.1 billion per year spent dealing with the health outcomes of poverty. So poverty is a public health emergency. On a more individual basis, when I see my patients who are struggling with their income, I immediately know what I can't offer them, things that I can't get them, right? So I can't get them better, which is AKA more expensive, drugs for, well, pretty much everything. So for example, new treatments for diabetes, blood thinners that are like not just more effective, but actually safer, puffers that work better. How about ADHD drugs that have fewer side effects? Can't access them. Also our non-drug related treatments like massage therapy or going to a chiropractor, can't access it. And access to other things are just severely restricted, like access to counseling, access to physiotherapy. How about access to psychoeducational testing for kids who are struggling at school, right? No wonder these chronic conditions are poorly controlled. We don't have the resources to manage them in our patients living with poverty compared to our patients who have insurance and income. So what's the answer? I think we know what the answer is, but I'm going to go through it anyway. When your potassium is low, we give potassium. When you don't make enough insulin, we will give you insulin. And if you don't have enough money, if that's the source of your health problem, I think we just need to give money. And there are, of course, studies that support this. So the one that popped into my mind was a study I'd read a number of years ago in British Columbia. And again, this is alluded to by some of our other panelists here, where they studied women who were living in poverty and who were pregnant. And they gave money, so no strings attached money. And I think some of the expectation was, you know, how will people spend it? We can't have judgment on how people spend it. Again, it's like that, you know, the $25 gift certificate for Sobeys, like hopefully they'll spend it on fresh vegetables, not craft dinner, you know, and all of these things that we judge. But this study just looked at giving, it was a check per month to women who were pregnant, who were living in poverty. And what they were checking was the outcomes of the pregnancy. And then they followed those babies through, I can't remember if it was to 12 months or 18 months. And every single marker of pregnancy outcomes and early childhood outcomes were improved in the group that got money. We don't know what they spent it on. They might have spent it on their cell phone bill. They might have spent it on groceries. You know what? Some of them might have spent it on cigarettes or pot. Like, I mean, we don't control that, right? And it's not our job to judge people on their choices. It's just our job to lift people out of poverty. And we know that if you do that by itself, you will improve outcomes. So as it stands today, I kind of work the system a little bit, and some people have mentioned that already. So when my patients come in who are on social assistance, I automatically offer up the special diet and the phone, right? Because who doesn't need a high fiber, low cholesterol, fresh fruits and vegetables diet? Everybody does, and everybody needs a phone. But it's not enough, and it doesn't help enough. And I feel like we shouldn't have to game the system to make it work. The system needs to work better I think we need to remember that this isn't a special interest issue. This is a public health emergency that needs to be solved.
Thanks so much, Joan, and thanks both for sharing a bit of your own story, and I think giving us a real glimpse into the frustration that comes with the way the system is set up against what your profession is supposed to be doing, and that's thank you again for sharing that. If there are any like health policy nerds in this room, one thing this reminded me of, we just went through this big process in my own province, Newfoundland and Labrador, of kind of redefining what our health system should be and asking how do we fix healthcare and health, and it recommended a guaranteed basic income not once but twice in our health accord, because it's just so completely clear that we can't manage health in a good way without managing income. So thanks for making that so crystal clear, Joan. We have one more panelist to hear from before we go into conversation. So we'll next go back into the room here to Elle Jones, who of course many of you would know. So Elle is a poet, a journalist, a professor, and an activist living here in Halifax. She teaches in the Department of Political and Canadian Studies at Mount St. Vincent, where she was named the 15th Nancy's Chair in Women's Studies in 2017. Her work focuses on social justice issues such as feminism, prison abolition, anti-racism, and decolonization. She's poet laureate here from 2013 to 2015. She's the author of Live from the African Resistance, which is a collection of poems about resisting white colonialism. And since 2016, she's co-hosted a radio show called Black Power Hour on CKDU FM, where listeners from prisons get to call in and rap and read their poetry. And that provides a voice to people who rarely get that kind of wide audience. Ella led the subcommittee and co-authored the 2020 report entitled Defunding the Police, Defining the Way Forward for HRM. So welcome, Elle, we're glad to hear from you.
Thank you. And I do apologize, I have to leave right after I speak. I have to run around the corner to go to the Black Youth Science Fair. So sorry, everybody. A little bit of personal history. I'm actually the product of a huge accident of fate. My mother's from Trinidad, and like most so-called developing countries, which are of course the previously colonized countries, the black and brown countries of the world, there is no social assistance to speak of. And I'm only here today because my aunt happened to score third in the island on an exam she wrote at age 11, so 4 hours of the day, that allowed her access to a private school, that allowed her access to university, and my whole family came up with her. So off her back, my family rose from poverty. That is not a success story. I'm sure there's some conservatives listening like, great, things work as they are. 1% of people essentially in these countries get access. So if my aunt had been sick on that day, if there'd been some different questions, nothing, I would not live, I would not be in the situation that I'm in. And that is not a just system when it depends upon these kind of accidents that people have to take a test or get one kind of access or have one kind of special talent, and that's seen as some kind of justice. Oh, well, if you play ball, then you could be dead or in jail, but now you're a football player, so it's all fine, right? This is not how justice works. So I say that when we think about issues of a basic income, these are also deep issues of racial and gender justice and global justice as well. Because the fact is we have always redistributed wealth, because the working classes of the world have always done the labor that underlies the wealth of the world, and that is always redistributed upwards to everybody else. So whether that's the so-called developing countries, the poor working classes, who are the massive people across the world who actually generate wealth. So the idea that we just can't redistribute wealth is a lie. We're always redistributing it, we're just sending it upwards, and it's time to send it to everybody else. And we've already had people discuss that, the amount of subsidies there are for corporations. If Amazon wanted to come here, we would roll the red carpet out and build all kinds of roads. We'd give them, millions, hundreds of millions to cross here, but then we can't somehow do something for everybody else. This has been addressed already, but this is of course the myth of the deserving versus the undeserving poor. So, if you're supposedly, work hard and pull up your bootstraps and do this, and you might get into the moral category of the people who deserve something, and then everybody has to constantly prove that they're part of that deserving class and not undeserving. And of course, you can always slip into being undeserving, because if you're a woman and you have a child and you're not married, then you're undeserving and you're living off the system. If you have an accident of health and you become unhoused, now you're living off the system. If you have a disability, now so these categories that anybody can become part of is seen as these moral categories. But of course, this has nothing to do with morality at all. And we've heard that all through the day. I did want to say, I'm sorry, I'm trying to go fast. I did want to say too that this is a huge issue of gender justice in particular. When we talk about the wealth and income gap that exists for women, we also know that women are doing the vast majority. They live in poverty. Women are redistributing wealth all the time. It's women that are sharing income with each other, women that are doing childcare for free. So we can't have gender equality in Canada and maintain a financial inequality system when we know that it's women and children that are also disproportionately and vastly affected, and of course, Indigenous women and Black women as well. When we think about redistributing wealth as well, or financial justice, it's also important to, again, not create categories of, well, who's in and who's out. So for example, people emerging from incarceration would be put heavily into the category of undeserving. I don't want to subsidize a criminal. But of course, we spend $370 a day. I think it's like over 300 now, 313, I'm sorry, dollars a day to keep people in provincial jail, like $40,000 per person a month to keep people in provincial jail, when of course we don't want to give people even some kind of income when they get out, to get on their feet, to get housing, to break the actual cycles of criminalization from social causes. To give one example as well, a young woman I know who grew up in the child welfare system, so obviously no familial supports, vastly mistreated as many people are within the so-called child welfare system. Because she's a refugee, her documents don't have her correct information, so she has different names of birth and names across different documents, which has happened to many people who come as refugees. So her documents not being regularized mean that she is constantly being cut off things like the child, like getting her child, I can't think of that. Thank you. Getting the child money, they'll accuse her of having all these different stuff. So she's constantly getting her money pulled back. It's $500+ to get those documents regularized. She can't afford it. So this has been an ongoing issue where she is constantly losing money, having to try, getting evicted as a result. All of that could be averted. The amount of resources that go into evicting this woman, cutting her out of child welfare, policing what's happening, when you could simply give her an income, allow her to get back on her feet, allow her to get time to get an education, allow her time to care for her children, and that whole family would be able to live. Instead, there's all these resources being dedicated to policing her, to like asking questions about her check and her documents, which is like the millions that we spend, we outspend these systems in like policing the 1% of 1% that are allegedly committing some kind of fraud, instead of actually just giving people that money. We'll spend money on transit cops to make sure that people aren't taking the bus for free or the subway for free, instead of just like making it free, you know? So we have all kinds of money to spend on surveillance, on policing, on control, and then no money to spend, and it would just take people $500 or $1,000 or $2,000 to actually make that shift if we could sustain that money. And so I'll finally say, because I know I'm kind of running out of time, that talking about basic income is part of a broader reparative justice movement. And we may not think of them together, but we're talking about this all over the place. So reparations, when we talk about that, we're talking about redistributing wealth from those who have it in ill-gotten ways based off the back of the labor of slavery, and in giving it back to those who worked. When we talk about defunding, we're talking about stop putting money into punishments and policing and prisons, and redistribute that money into places that promote healing, transformation, help, treatment, and assistance. And talking about basic income is part of that as well. So we are in a moment where we understand that the way we spend our budget is a deep justice issue, and all we have to do is make those shifts. It shouldn't be a big deal to say, instead of wasting money policing who's allegedly committing fraud, punishing people for that, spending money to keep them in jail, spending all this money on punishment and control, we could simply give that money to people to be spent on well-being and healing and health and our community. And we are already doing this amongst ourselves. So the idea that it doesn't work when people are constantly every day sending money home to their families, working multiple shifts for their community, we know it can be done. The only people that believe it can't be done is our government. So I'll just say that we have to extend this idea, not just notions of citizens or good people or those who have had a job or those who just had an accident, but to everybody, including migrant workers, including people without status, including those with criminalization, with records, everybody. Because when we exclude one group, it becomes easier to keep saying, well, not you, well, not you, and that line of not will always move until it's us. So the only way to assure justice for all is to make sure we are all collectively included without these questions, without a moral judgment, and without deciding who's in and who's out, because we cannot have a society unless we're all in. So I will stop there, and I'm sorry, I do have to run.
Thanks so much, Elle, and good luck with the science fair, too. That was so touched on so much, I think, of what we've been talking about here today. So that winds up the panel. Before we go to questions from the audience, because I'm sure there are lots of thoughts turning in people's heads, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I have a podium and a microphone. I want to switch gears just for a second with you folks, because I think we've just spent an hour really passionately diagnosing all the different ways that the system is broken, right? Yeah. And I just want to switch gears. Let's imagine for ourselves that we fix it, that we win. A basic income is here, it happened. And Aron, you touched on this in your remarks, and I'd like to give everyone a chance, and you as well, maybe to reflect on, like, how would it feel? Imagine you woke up tomorrow and what we're dreaming of has come true. And maybe I'll pass to you first, Kendall. We can just go down the line. Like, what do you think? And you don't have to go first, Kendall. You can if you like, but
I thought you wanted Aron to go first in the way you were talking, but anyway,
sorry.
the answer that I can give to that question is we would see a lot of improvement with the various situations that I described in my speech. The homeless population would decrease. The one thing I forgot to mention in my speech is the increase in food bank usage. However, I did mention inflation behaving out of control, but people would be able to better control what they spend out of on food while the inflation is what it is. And keep our fingers crossed someday that inflation will start decreasing the prices we see in the grocery store, But yeah, I think we would be overall able to live better. That's what it's about. Mental health would improve and there'd be less social isolation.
Thanks, Kendall. Aron, yeah. Aron, I wonder if you touched on this a little bit in your remarks, but like, how would it feel if we woke up tomorrow and the basic income was there? We had that floor underneath us.
Well, again, assuming that it's...
Assuming it's a good one. A livable income, I think is, yeah.
Assuming that it's livable, adequate. It would be a huge relief. I'm sure that my blood pressure would drop by a few points.
I would say.
I remember, for example, being in emerge at one point with that very issue. And the doc asked me, what do you do for a living? I said, well, I don't work a regular waged position anymore. These days, my boss is a Jewish carpenter. And he said, well, where's your income? So, income assistance. And his response was, oh God, no wonder your blood pressure is so high. So there would be emotional, intellectual, and measurable physical and physiological outcomes right across the board, of which that is just one little example.
Yeah, that's so well put. Thank you. Eric, how about you? Like, thinking of the folks that you hang out with every day, like, how do you think folks would feel if this happened?
I would feel suspicious.
You would feel suspicious.
Like Aron said, when's the other shoe going to drop? Like with CERB, it was great, but then it was like, oh wait, now they're clawing it back because people committed fraud or whatever it was, like double dipping or something like that. So it's in my nature to not trust any of these things because the government often has conniving ways to screw people over.
Oh yeah.
But I don't know, I guess in all things being good, it would be amazing and I'd be really happy and I'd move on to other things and how can we expand this system to everybody, like El was saying.
That's the most activist thing that you could possibly say. Well, okay, move on to the next thing. Fair enough. Joan, how about you? Like, what do you think, how would it feel to you or to the patients you're supporting if this happened?
So right off the bat, I think I would be like, oh my God, it's going to make it so much easier. Like just easier is the feeling I get immediately. Like I remember I had a patient with diabetes who had no insurance and couldn't pay for things. And then his wife started working and he got insurance. And I just remember him coming in and us kind of doing a little happy dance and me being like, you have no idea what I'm prescribing now. and you know, and then his hemoglobin A1C, the marker of how well his diabetes is doing, you know, went from like 10 down to 7.2. I mean, just easier.
Yeah, ease and relief is a big theme here. Thanks, everyone. I'll stop dominating now and open up the room to hands. I believe one of the lovely humans from the library has a mic that floats around in the back. So I'll try and point folks out, and we have some time to ask these wise folks some questions. Does anyone want to ask? Yeah, there's one right here. Well, from Leah. And the mic is circulating. Oh, amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Question for Dr. Salah. Do we have any data about what the relationship between income and health outcomes are beyond poverty? Are there magic numbers for populations to hit where, or is it a completely linear relationship? Anything you can say to expand on that?
So I'm afraid I don't have the answer to that. I don't know that a study has been done that looked at linear aspects of health outcomes. I know there's been some studies that looked at whether or not money buys happiness. And at one time I always felt like if you had your basic needs met, that increased money didn't buy increased happiness. And I think that's been recently debunked, that more money makes things easier and people have an easier time being happy. I don't know that I know any direct studies that correlate increasing, like other than raising up out of poverty and having your basic needs met is the only ones I'm aware of.
Thanks, Dr. Salah. We have another question here in the front row in the room.
All right, guys. So approximately $380 a month is given to people who are unhoused to live on, but it costs about $14,000 a month to keep somebody in prison. How do we incentivize the province to raise the amount for people where there's already a $12,000 difference between criminalizing it? So it costs $12,000 more to criminalize homelessness than to actually pay for it. What can we do more? And can I keep that $12,000 for myself every month?
Anyone want to jump in on this one? Kendall looks like
the one thing that needs to be understood about homeless people is homeless people are not criminals. Every situation within the homeless community is different, of course, from one homeless person to the next. So maybe a very small 5 to 10% out of the 100% population might be a criminal, but 95% of homeless are not criminals. It is safe to say that. And to your point, you do make a good point, Sean, and I do agree with you that they spend more money keeping, like criminalizing homeless or criminalizing anyone for that matter, compared to what they could be paying. And yes, and I believe that what we need to look at is the whole system of different crimes that they criminalize people for. I mean, okay, going to jail for something like a first-degree murder, that's understandable because you have no place in society if you're going to do things like assault someone, murder someone, kill someone, go on a rampage like that guy, Gabriel Wortman, who we all heard about like he did and then killed himself, but after he shot 22 other people. Going to jail for something like that is totally understandable. But say, for example, when you look at, I don't know, fraud, why not sentence those people to do community service in the community instead of jail and work off the hours that they defrauded? That would be a better solution. That way there, the justice system is saving money, and because it costs less to make them do community service work than it does to send them to jail. And that money that they're saving, that can be reinvested into a guaranteed livable income. That's one of many examples that you can point out. So you do bring up a good point.
Anyone else on the panel thoughts on this one, like how to make the case for investment on one side instead of on the prison side of the equation? I think that's a very powerful way of framing it, though. Any other questions in the room? I think Wayne did. Okay, go for it. There's a mic coming your way.
Right behind you. Okay. Hi. It's more of a comment than a question. Actually, I was going to respond to something you just brought up a few minutes ago. You said, well, how would it feel if suddenly this, you know what? You don't have to look very far. Ask anybody in this room or anywhere else who was on income assistance for many, many years and suddenly turned 65, how it felt. Because I can tell you, it felt wonderful to know that I had a secure check coming in every month, that I didn't have to justify it on a regular basis, I didn't have a caseworker to deal with. And all of a sudden I had enough money to do everything that I wanted to do.
That's such a good point, and it's such, you know, like we have to remember there's such a wealth there of that experience and what it means for people. Thanks, Wayne. Yeah,
just to follow up on what Wayne said, is that a few people I've been working with lately, they're usually couples, and one of the people in the couple is a few years older than the other person. And so it's interesting to me that combined, a couple on income assistance makes less money than one person who gets CPP, OAS, and guaranteed income supplement, because that $1,500, $1,600 a month is more than the $1,200 a month that those two people would get on that. So that means if your partner turns 65 and you're 60, you get completely cut off income assistance because your household income is more than what it was before, which is just one of those weird little, I don't know, idiosyncrasies of the system that just further punishes people for getting any kind of money at all.
That's wild. That is so wild.
And for me to answer that question, I would have to see what the difference is between what that person currently gets on income assistance and the figure they would get once they turn 65 to move over to GIS.
I feel like you have that at your fingertips, Wayne.
Yeah.
Basically, the difference is almost a doubling.
Almost double, yeah.
Basically, you're saying $950 right now, income assistance is close, it's around, depending on whether or not a person has CPP,
Yeah.
somewhere around in the neighborhood of $1,700 to $1,900 a month.
Wow, that is a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, so for folks online, when I was just saying, it is, depending on what your connection with CPP, it is almost doubling your income overnight, 64 to 65, which is indeed wild. I think we have a question just on the aisle there, and then there'll be one in the back, I think.
I'm not sure this is a question really, but there is a question at the heart of it.
All right, this is a mission for us.
One of the wonderful things about being at an event like this is that you are surrounded by people who feel exactly the way you do about these issues. But for a few seconds, maybe only, since I got here, there was somebody who stood up there and said, a guaranteed income for people who deserve it. And nobody said this was allowed to, you know, swim by. And that's sort of disappointing, I think. That's all.
Thanks. I think that's a really good point, because we, you know, I think for the most part, this conversation is exactly about getting rid of that concept of deservedness, right? So good call out. Thank you. It was a politician. Yes. And in the back, there was a question, I believe.
So I followed some of the Nova Scotia legislature, and just recently they've been speaking of a bill 259, which is in relation to income tax bracket. And I had taken some notes from March 22nd, 2023, and you can find the Nova Scotia legislature on YouTube. I time-stamped 2 hours, 30-minute mark, where PC MLA Tom Taggart had suggested that indexing the tax bracket, which would thereby lift more people out of poverty, that would cost the government $123 million for that 2023 year alone. And the suggestion was that indexing income tax brackets would impede government's ability to fix healthcare, which is what they've basically been running on. Now, I've heard a lot of speakers here today speak on income as being a primary indicator of health, and I'm wondering if any of the panelists here today might be able to speak on just this Nova Scotia government's practices alone, and maybe even on a federal level, of how indexing tax brackets further might help lift more folks out of poverty. Thank you.
So anyone on the panel want to take a crack at that?
I can. The bottom line is this current Tim Houston government, you are correct about the fact that they are running on wanting to improve the healthcare system, but what they are not thinking about is the social determinants of health, any improvement in that area going along with that. The social determinants of health includes the need for a basic guaranteed income. And I believe that if this Tim Houston government did take into consideration the social determinants of health, then this recent budget, being the second budget that they passed since this current Tim Houston government got into power, the least they would have done, if they even cared about the social determinants of health, is increase the income assistance rates, and the increase in the income assistance rates did not happen. And of course, yes, they could have at least introduced a bill to implement a guaranteed basic income in Nova Scotia. Yes.
Thanks. Eric, did you have something you
I
want
do.
to add on this one?
Tax policy is super complicated, but also super important. I don't really understand what you're talking about indexing the brackets, but I think the most important thing is are we taxing corporations appropriately? Are we taxing millionaires and billionaires appropriately? Because yes, I'd be happy to pay an extra couple of bucks in taxes, but I think more importantly we should stop taxing capital gains at half of what my income. Like, why is somebody working the stock market paying half as much taxes as I am, and why are we allowing depreciation of assets to be taxed so much less than anything else for corporations? So I think we need to fix a lot of other parts about the tax system too.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah. Jump in. I also
Joan, go ahead. Yeah, sorry, I see you trying to say something.
Sorry, I also don't know the ins and outs of the tax system, but I have two thoughts about it. The first is the point that had come up in my talk about the fact that just the healthcare dollars that we spend on forcing people to live in poverty by itself is a huge, I don't know, income drain on governments, if you want to put it that way. And so I think if we reinvest back, and I think governments always have a hard time investing in something that's going to cost money now, but pay out later, because governments change so quickly, but we need to be more long-term sighted. The other is, I always have a little bit, and I don't know that I understand that specific tax issue well myself, but I have a problem sometimes with the whole tax system, because you have to be making a certain amount of money even to be paying into taxes. So one of the things that's always bothered me is, for example, the disability tax credit, because it actually only benefits people who earn enough money to actually pay taxes. Whereas, for example, if you look at my sister who has autism and lives on her own, and my mother, who is the person who supports her so that she can live on her own, neither of them earn enough money to benefit at all from the disability tax credit. So I do think that there are ways to use the tax system to help lift people out of poverty, but I can't specifically speak to that one.
Thanks, Joan.
Do you have another question?
There's another question from the back. Go for it.
Oh, what can we as individuals do to make this better?
Oh, good question. No one's asked that yet today. What can we as individuals do to make it better? Anyone want to take this one? It looks like Aron might have a thought.
Well, you can.
Pull the mic up close to yourself there now, Aron.
Oh, whoops. Well, you can make your position known on that to your elected representatives. Politicians tend to and those in government, generally tend to pay attention to what the mass electorate want. And if there's a threat that maybe their majority will be reduced if they don't do X, Y, or Z, they're more likely to pay attention to that. So, write letters, talk to your MLA, MPs, write letters to newspapers and other media. Just let it be known that you would like to see this happen. That's not the whole puzzle on that score, but it's part of it.
Thanks. Anyone else on what individuals can do? Kendall, did you have thought?
Yes, and to add to what Aron Spidel just said, speaking of us as individuals in general, the more the government does not do things like raise the income assistance rates or introduce any type of program federally, and even in Parliament, as slow as they are going with getting the work done on Bill C-22, the longer we are in this current situation of not receiving enough money to live on, the more pressure is being put on the community. It's those factors right there that I just mentioned of no increase in the income assistance rates, the non-existence of a livable guaranteed income, and not enough money to live on in general is what's causing food bank usage to be high and increasing as time goes on. It's causing more people to show up at the soup kitchens and taking seats away from those who are really down and out and homeless that really need those seats at the soup kitchens. So yeah, we got to think about that too when it comes to writing to your MP or MLA as points to raise, is the community pressure.
Thanks, Kendall. Eric, Joan, any thoughts on what individuals can do? Good. All right, I think there were maybe one or two other hands up. I'm trying to remember. There's one more in the back.
There's a question at the back.
We got a good back row going back here today. This is excellent. All right.
Hello, everyone. This is Rashad. So I moved in Halifax like a couple of years ago, and I would like to thank you that everyone attending and also the panels for this. So I have suggestions and one question. The suggestions is I'm just wondering that people such as myself, I want the basic income to be implemented because it benefits me honestly, because but the people who are rich, right? So obviously it's not gonna, they wouldn't see the benefit. So how can we, or what can we do so that those people who see there's a benefit to implement the basic income? Because when people have enough, their basic needs are met, then they're socially more productive, and that's uplift the whole society, because we tend to forget that we are a collective embody, right? It's not just me versus them, or the society versus the government, this and that, right? So can we propose that maybe once someone earn a certain threshold, maybe $10 million or something, then that person can no longer increase their assets or something like that? Because when people is starting making that kind of money, so now they're thinking about going we are killing the planet, right? Now we're going to the Mars, right? So then we're gonna kill that too. So it's so where does it end, right? So, and my questions goes to that, I'm not at the moment on basic income, but I know some people are. And then when someone is on the basic income, so what happened is that if you have maybe less than a few $100s, they wouldn't give you the money, right? So they want to keep you, the system wants to keep you poor, right? So because if someone is poor, that person can no longer help the society, right? So that's, we got to understand that, right? So my questions to panel, anyone can answer that. How do we, what can we do so that the people who are in charge for this, they see the value that, okay, we need to help people to get out of poverty, not to just keep them in the system so that they keep coming back for a handout sort of, right? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone on the panel want to take that question? How do we get this in the heads of the people on top? Any thoughts?
So we have experienced similar challenges, I think, before in terms of things that were maybe like really helpful to people, but not maybe super popular among people who were wealthy, right? So I think back to when, for example, methadone clinics were first sort of being introduced, and there was a fair bit of pushback, like, why on earth would the government pay to give drugs to, I'm going to say this in quotation marks, addicts? And the conversation that had to happen around why that was actually a good, again, public health investment, you know, that again, it brought people dignity, that it made people able to be productive members of society. And it was kind of one of those unfortunate things, I think, where a lot of the education had to be around how it would benefit the wealthy person, right? So less crime in your neighborhood, and, you know, fewer needles in your kids' parks or something like that, right? And I always felt awful that the conversation was not around like the basic humanity of it. But I think really we just have to argue on both ends. We have to argue that this is evidence-based, good public health policy, and that, like, you know, we could clutch our pearls and say, my God, the humanity, look at the children.
Well said, Joan. Thank you. And we've got just maybe time for one more question. Wondering, Joan, at your end in Sydney, if anyone has a question down that way. We can't see the folks in the room, and you can. So
they're all shaking their heads. And
all right. Well, forever hold your peace, I suppose, Sydney folks. We have time for one more quick question. I feel like, oh, there's one up front. So maybe someone we haven't heard from yet in this session. I believe that's probably right up front here.
Hi. So as you know, 70% of people on income assistance in Nova Scotia identify as having a disability. And I've noticed, quite sadly, that some of the people living in tents right now are actually severely physically disabled. And in fact, one of them I know is a wheelchair user, because I got an email from somebody asking, what can I do for this person, because they're going to be out of a hotel in 2 days and their wheelchair is broken, so they literally won't be able to like move. So I wonder, what are the supports out there for people who are in need of some sort of physical assistance? Like, she couldn't afford to get her chair fixed, so what, you just dump her on the sidewalk and there you go? And many of the shelters are not wheelchair accessible or wheelchair friendly. So where are these people supposed to go? How do we help them without locking them in hospitals or institutions like I was for 10 years?
Thanks so much. Eric, I saw you nodding along there. Did you have a thought on this one?
This on? Yeah, well, Vicky knows probably better than most people about the conditions that people living in tents are. I know Vicky was there all last year at the People's Park. And it's sad. It really comes up quite often of people with severe mobility issues living in tents. And as Vicky says, there's very few wheelchair accessible shelters. And so, like, what do we do? Hopefully that person can get into a hotel or something like that. But we all know that hotels are not an option, and there's no accessible apartments to be found. There's barely any apartments to be found, let alone an accessible apartment to be found. So it's one of those things that just, I think, another example of why guaranteed income would be helpful. But if you're getting $2,000 a month and you're living in a wheelchair, that's probably not enough to be able to afford to be able to find any apartment. So we also need to keep funding the existing services more, because there's, $2,000 won't cut it, or whatever, basically won't cut it for somebody living in a tent in a wheelchair.
Thanks, Eric. And thanks. That's I think a really strong call to action to keep thinking after this. We're at time for this session now. So I just want to maybe ask everyone to give our panelists a round of applause for all their wisdom. Thank you all so much. This isn't an easy thing to get up in front of a room of strangers and talk about for any of you folks. So I just want to say thanks for trusting us with it. We'll take a 15-minute break.